I want to welcome you all to the end of our celebration, year-long celebration of the Robert Long House. And thank you all for coming and for the support that you've given to us. We hope to continue on during this year with some programs highlighting the house and other historic aspects of what we do. We are going to continue working on the house. You know, the idea is to bring it back to its former glory. We did install a heating and cooling system, which will protect the house through this horrible winter that we had. And we are working on a bond with the state so that we can repair the roof and other parts of the house that have been damaged, flood damage and so on. Again, I want to welcome you all and thank you for coming and for your support. And I want to turn this over to the head, the chairman of the committee that organized this year-long celebration. David, please.
Thank you, Kathleen. Can you all hear me without the speaker? Or do you know? No. What? It's too much. Too much for me to do. Too much technology. It's going to be weird. Anyway, I'd like to thank you all for coming to the concluding event of the 250th anniversary celebration of the construction of the Robert Long House. I'd like to thank the committee members, Peter Perry, Margaret DeArchangelis, Romaine Somerville, and Helena Hicks, for all the support and the good advice that they gave as we set the series of lectures and the panel discussion that we had. I think we learned a lot about Fells Point that we sort of implied, but no one had ever spoken about. There's so much history at Fells Point. It's not just the 18th century romantic shipbuilding and the maritime industries there, but there's a whole history of the industrial technologies in America through the 1830s and up through 1900. They're all the wonderful stories of the immigrants, the Polish immigrants, the German immigrants that all came to America and came to Fells Point and found their fortunes and left a wonderful cultural heritage. If walking through the streets of Fells Point, you see all the churches and the cultural institutions that they left. It's really a very rich and marvelous environment, and we're so lucky to have it. And I think that the Robert Long House mirrors so much of that history and the fact the house, when it was built as a residence, and it continued as such to probably about the 1850s, and then it became a boarding house, and it became other sort of industrial usages. And by the 1960s, the house was pretty much vacant. And luckily, in America, there was the rise of the preservation movement, and through the efforts of the Preservation Society, the house was reborn and is a wonderful testament to the vision and the ideas of the founders of the Preservation Society and what they brought forward. I'd like to thank also Kara Joyce, who provided all the wonderful refreshments for the receptions that we've had. And to Doug Franz, is always available to provide whatever extra we need for whatever event. I've known Doug for over 30 years, and as a member of the Fun Festival Committee, Doug was indispensable. Thank you, Doug, for all your help, all your favor. And of course, Marta Coomer. Marta has become the caretaker of the Robert Long House and has certainly invested so much time and effort in making sure that it continues in good shape and in stable condition. And thank you very much, Marta, for all you've done. And I guess I'd like to just say that the Preservation Society this coming year is looking for new growth and looking to develop new programs in all for Baltimore, new educational programs, new efforts to come back and to really to show the history of Fells Point. and to show what a wonderful neighborhood this is and how it has contributed not only to Baltimore's economy, but also on a national scope and how it fits in with preservation and the efforts made on a national level. So, Bob Embry is our guest speaker. I don't, Bob, he's coming. Perfect timing. Bob Embry is always perfectly timed. He walks in just as the bell comes up. So with that, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Robert Embry Jr. Sorry. I've been remiss. I want to thank Second Chance for their wonderful hospitality here this afternoon, for organizing the space and providing us with sort of a wonderful environment here that talks not only about architecture, but for second chances. The educational programs they have here are really wonderful and make a wonderful contribution to the community. So Kathy Bradley is representing Mark Foster. Kathy, would you like to say a few words?
I'd love to. Thank you. We're so thrilled to be able to offer this space for the Preservation Society's event here today. And one of the wonderful things about this space to us is that all of the things that you see around you have all been donated. Second Chance is a nonprofit. We run 2 social enterprises here at 1700 Ridgely. One of them is a deconstruction practice where we dismantle old structures that are scheduled for demolition and bring all these beautiful materials back here to our warehouse store for other people to use and to enjoy. And we also accept donations of furniture and artwork and pillars and shutters, you name it, all to provide part of some of the funds that we need to pay for our workforce development programs. We retrain people here who have barriers to employment and employ them in both our social enterprises, both our retail store, and in our deconstruction practice. Last year, we trained 180 people who have barriers to employment, such as chronic unemployment or educational deficits, or for about 65% of our employees have criminal records, but they come here to rebuild their lives, and thanks to our Second Chance donors and shoppers, we're able to train people and set them out on a totally different course in their lives. For that, we're greatly appreciative. Welcome, and thank you very much for being our guest, Mr. Embry.
I'd just like to make a few comments about Bob's career. It could go on forever, but I'm just going to be very short. Mr. Embry was former Commissioner for Housing and Community Development in Baltimore City. He was Assistant Secretary of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development in the Carter administration. He was a former president of the school board and currently is president of the Abell Foundation. As commissioner, and this is really very important, I think, in connection with the Robert Long House and its renovations and reincarnation. As Commissioner for Housing and Community Development, Bob initiated the Dollar House program for Sterling Street, which captured the imagination of a generation by demonstrating the potentials of preservation and creating exciting, vibrant new neighborhoods and historic yet economically depressed districts of the city. The success of the Dollar House program on Sterling Street led to a similar Dollar House program for the Otterbein and Berry Street neighborhoods around the Inner Harbor. Much of the redevelopment of Fells Point and Federal Hill can be attributed to another program developed under Mr. Embry's leadership, which offered for sale at market rate houses that had been acquired for the federal highway that was slated to go through the most historic districts sections of Federal Hill and Fells Point. Due to the success and the interest created by the Dollar House programs, the sale of houses in Fells Point and Federal Hill attracted a large audience that resulted in their sales almost immediately as they came on the market. So in many ways, the Robert Long House, the dollar programs have all contributed in their own way to the remarkable rebirth of the city. So with that, I'd like to introduce Bob Embry.
This work? Thank you. I work for the Abell Foundation now, which is a local foundation involved with the city, and we were fortunate enough to finance this building, among other things, so very appropriate that we're here today. I'm not quite clear what I'm to talk about, but I have enough things to talk about so you can tell me to stop when you want. Just starting back with the reference to the Dollar House program, Senator Howard. The Dollar House program really came about because of Senator Lapidus that I happen to see sitting here, who, when I became housing commissioner in 1968, I'd grown up in northeast Baltimore in the Lock Raven, Belvedere area, and had gone to public schools in Baltimore, gone to city, and gone away to college. When I ran for the city council from northeast Baltimore, was elected, and then became housing commissioner, historic preservation never really had crossed my mind. Nobody ever mentioned it to me. I didn't really have any thought about it. And Sterling Street was part of the planned demolition of the Old Town Urban Renewal Project in East Baltimore, just off of Bay Street and Monument. And I don't know how Senator Lapidus brought to my attention, and I may not remember it correctly, but it was either his wife, is that who it was? An article in the News American or someplace that said Sterling Street might be kept up rather than be torn down, and that was the beginning really of my consciousness of historic preservation. We saved Sterling Street, and as pointed out, the Dollar House program in the city was the biggest Dollar House program, bigger than all the other homesteading programs in the country combined. And why was that? And why doesn't it exist today? It's one subject that might be of interest to you. The reason that the Baltimore City program succeeded was because it had several unique elements. First place, it had a home ownership office that had people there to assist a purchaser of a house to find an architect and find a builder, because the overwhelming majority of people who wanted to homestead had never fixed up a house and didn't know where to begin. So the city provided that assistance to them. The second missing element was financing. A vacant house is vacant usually because there's no market for it. And so if you want to put today $150,000 or $200,000 into a house in a block where the houses are being given away or going for $5,000, how are you going to find a bank to lend you the money? How are you going to get an appraisal for a $200,000 house when the market rate is $5,000 or $10,000 for houses in the neighborhood? So the city floated bonds and supplied the mortgages at the tax-exempt rate that the city was paying on its bond, which was a very low interest rate. And the criticism at the time was, well, people won't pay it back, the city's going to lose a lot of money. As a matter of fact, we made money, the city made money on that loan program, not only in terms of the loan, but the taxes, obviously, that were paid for those houses once they were rehabilitated, and the savings on the cost of boarding houses up and the fire, putting out fires and so forth. There was a dramatic financial benefit to the city, much less the piggyback taxes that the income taxes that the people moving into the houses paid to the city that they otherwise wouldn't have paid. So it's an unbelievable plus. The highway program, and I don't know, some of you are old enough to remember very few of you as I look around the room, but some of you might be old enough to remember the very much disputed expressway program through the city that during the Schaefer administration that ended at Martin Luther King, really, from the west, and ended at I-95 coming in around Boston Street from the east. And as some of you may know, it was to be connected by a road, I-83, going along through Fells Point, across the Inner Harbor, through Montgomery Street, and then up on Barry Circle to connect with the Franklin Mulberry connection. As Commissioner of Housing and Community Development, Mayor Schaefer asked me to become, in addition to that, the development coordinator for the city and to chair the effort both for the expressway and for the new subway mass transit proposal that was in before the city. And I recommended to the mayor, mayor and subsequent governor, that the expressway be stopped, and other people did, so I don't want to attribute my recommendation to being the only one or even the major one, but as development coordinator, it was my job to make a decision, make a recommendation on that. So I'm thinking, looking back on it, a few people would think that the city made a mistake in not tearing down the front of Federal Hill and extending on through Ann Arbor East and Fells Point and Kent to connect with the I-95. Several issues that the city faces may be of interest to you, and any wisdom you have on it, I would appreciate. One of my good fortune is to be on the City Commission on Historical and Architectural Preservation, CHAP, as you probably most of you are very familiar with. And a dispute in CHAP, of which I'm on one side and others on another. I don't call out David, I don't remember how he ended up with this, but generally it's the architects versus the non-architects. I'm a non-architect. The dispute I flippantly refer to as the Prince Charles dispute, of which I'm on Prince Charles's side, and architects, not all, but some are on the other side. And that is when you're restoring, when you're building a new house or a new structure in a historic neighborhood, should you replicate the historic houses that are along that front, or should you build something that clearly stands out as different? Same scale, so it's not a high-rise, it's a three-story building, but it clearly is distinguished from the other houses that adjoin it. And I'm on the replication side of the fence. I think, not that you should be required to, but you shouldn't be penalized if you want to replicate the historic design of that block, of that community. The contrasting view, and they may want to speak on that side if he's on it later, is no, you don't want to confuse people that they don't know that that house was built in 2016. They may think it was built in 1806, and it should be clearly differentiated from the surrounding houses. And so that's a continuing dispute. People of goodwill, both sides have an argument, and I can see the wisdom, the goodwill of the other side, but it's a continual debate within the CHAP that comes up periodically. Another issue that I appreciate your thought on is the Coleman report. And those of you might say, what's this have to do with housing? I'll get to it in a second. The Coleman report in 1966 was commissioned by the Federal Department of Education. Two professors at Johns Hopkins, James Coleman and Peter Lawson, were asked to tell the federal government what was the major lever that would affect educational outcomes of poor children. And because they want to know what the federal policy should be toward education, mainly of inner city minority children. So even 50 years ago, closing the gap was an issue in education. This is only 10 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And the Coleman report came back with what you would say, or the average person would say walking down the street. You'd say, what's the major determinant of how a child does in school? And you would say the mother or the parents is the major determinant. What's the second most important ingredient? Where the child lives and who the child plays with, who the child associates with. What's the third most important? In the school, it's the teacher. So the first two are outside the school, outside the control of the school system. You can't control in a democratic society who has children and who doesn't. And what can you do about the second most important, where the child lives and who the child plays with? And those of you with children know that a child for the first few years looks vertically. It looks to adults for their reinforcement of their values. What do their parents think about what they're doing? What's the teacher think about what they're doing? And when they get to 12 years old, 13, 14 years old, they begin to look horizontally. They take their values from their peers, or increasingly from their peers. So who they're associating with, whether the child expects to do their homework, come to school, go to college, so forth, has a major influence on that child's view of themselves and their progress in the school system. So a number of years ago, the Supreme Court, this is after President Nixon was elected in 1968, and what was the Warren Court up until 1968 became the Burger Court in the 1970s, and their political ideology swung dramatically from progressive to conservative. And a suit was brought in Texas to question the inequity of funding of schools, that rich jurisdictions that had higher property taxes had more money spent on schools, and poor jurisdictions that had lower property taxes had less spent, or lower property assessment. And the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that was not a federal issue, and that they wouldn't get into the inequity in funding. Then a suit was brought, the Milligan case in Detroit. This is the follow-on of Brown versus Board of Education. Segregation was unconstitutional. Segregation based on race was unconstitutional. The Milligan case in Detroit, the plaintiffs sued there and said they could not integrate the schools in Detroit because there wasn't anybody to integrate with. That all the school's students were African American, or overwhelmingly African American. So if you wanted to integrate the schools, you had to have a regional solution. And Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that no, you could not go beyond the jurisdiction to get relief for school segregation. So that meant schools like Baltimore, for instance, which in 1954, 1955, were integrated racially. My senior year in high school, were the first African American children, after the 8 course in Poly, but the major African American integration began in 1955. Baltimore public schools today are as segregated almost as they were in 1954, but they're segregated worse than they were in 1954, because in 1954 the African American neighborhoods were segregated residentially as well as segregated residentially, so that the African American schools, the culture of those schools was set by the African American middle class who lived in those African American neighborhoods. The postal workers, the ministers, the teachers, and so forth, set the values for those schools. Since then, the African American middle class has overwhelmingly moved out much of the inner city, so that the schools are not only 100% African American, but they're 92%, 94%, sometimes 99% free and reduced lunch, that is poor, and overwhelmingly single parent families. So there are very few parents, fathers, in the home, and very few parents with college education. So Baltimore City public schools are, to some degree, more challenging than they were in 1954. Now, what's that have to do with housing? The third Supreme Court case is the Gautreaux case in Chicago. And in the Gautreaux case, the plaintiffs were public housing residents in Chicago. And they sued and said Chicago Board of Aldermen and HUD had segregated public housing in Chicago, that they built public housing only in African American neighborhoods. So African American children were just living in all black and all poor neighborhoods. And it went up and down, up and down. Finally, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs under the Fair Housing Act, not under the Equal Protection Clause. And just at that time, in the mid-70s, there was a revolution in public housing structure. Up until then, the 1930s New Deal public housing program had turned money over to local housing authorities to build projects. So if you wanted public housing, you had to live in a public housing project. In the mid-70s, the Section 8, then called the Section 8 program, was passed, which is a voucher program. which gave a poor person a voucher. They could go out to the private market, and where a landlord would rent to them at a reasonable rent, the federal government would pay the difference between the rent and what the tenant could afford. It was 30% of their income, the same formula for public housing projects. So overnight, there was a revolution in where poor people could live who got federal assistance. So the control decision gave 5,000 Section 8 certificates to low-income mothers in public housing in Chicago to move out of Chicago in the suburban, non-segregated, non-racially impacted, non-poverty impacted census tracts. And Northwestern subsequently evaluated the program and determined the difference in educational outcome of the children who moved and the children who applied but didn't get a certificate, and found overwhelmingly positive benefit from the people who moved. That all gets back to my point about Baltimore City, where a control case was brought by the American Civil Liberties Union with our funding and at our suggestion, and won and got 4,500 rent certificates for African American mothers with small children to move out of the city into census tracts that had low African American population and low poverty population. And so far, 3,100 families of the 4,500 moved. An average of 3 people a family, so that 3 times 3.1, 3.2 times 3,100, you're talking about roughly 10,000 people. Now, what are the policy implications of that? The mayor wants to attract 10,000 people to Baltimore. At the same time, we're moving out 10,000 people. We're helping 10,000 people who want to move out of the city. And where are they moving from? They're moving from low-income neighborhoods. And what does that mean in the low-income neighborhood? It means probably there's going to be a vacant house if that family moves out. Is the city better off? Is the family better off? How would you decide on that equation? So that is going on. And if you go through Riggs Avenue or Abell or Carrollton or anywhere, East Baltimore, go out Middle Street, you see a vacant house, and I'll get to Hogan's initiative in a second. You see a vacant house, you say, wasn't that awful? Isn't the city going to hell? Well, it's really, if you look at it another way, it's a great success story. It means a low-income family has moved out of a very low-income neighborhood to someplace else. It means somebody has moved out of a lead-paint house to a house that probably doesn't have lead paint in it. It means their child is not going to a school that's economically and racially segregated. They're going to a school that probably is more affluent, more middle class than where they were. So it's the downside of a positive movement. And what about Governor Hogan for a second? Governor Hogan, some of you may have noted, recently announced, along with the mayor, an initiative that bears on preservation, in that he said that he would, well, the press misreported it. Well, they reported it accurately, but what the governor said was inaccurate. The governor said that he would provide $75 million for demolition of houses in the city. Now, the governor doesn't have the authority to provide money from the city. What he should have said is that he will ask the Legislative General Assembly if they would appropriate in future years about $20 million a year for 4 years to provide money for demolition of housing in Baltimore. So start off with is a unintended misrepresentation there. As you noted, the governor in his budget that he submitted to the General Assembly a few days ago didn't include any money for demolition in Baltimore City. And when asked about it, he said that he would maybe put it in the supplemental budget request that would be made later. Why would he do that? The senator could speculate on his motivation better than I, but that budget is very much of a ability to influence legislators by including things in it that they want in return for their vote. So that may be a motive. He may submit it, he may request it, the General Assembly may approve it. The point is that the money is not the governor's just to say, here it is. Similarly, Obamacare, for instance, it was Congress that passed the legislation that created the health care program in the state. The president passed it, he signed it. And many things are attributed to chief executives of the state or shorthand that really are up to the legislative body to take the action, and the chief executive either signs it or doesn't sign it. But, so what about the demolition program? The second misrepresentation is that it is a block program. And I thought, in hearing that what they meant were 4 sides of a block were going to be demolished so that you create a site to build something on. So I called up and asked about it. I said, well, how are you going to do that? Because there are very few blocks, 4 sides of a block that don't have people living interspersed. And they said, no, it's a block face program. So what they mean is it's a 1600 block west side of Stricker Street, we'll say, where the demolition, the governor participated in demolition. It's just that face of the block that's torn down. All right, for good or bad. How are the houses selected? Well, the city had already scheduled houses for demolition, and there's a list available if anybody wants to look at it and want to go out and drive around and see whether you agree whether these houses should be torn down. But if you look at the list, it's 1 house, 2 house, 3 house, 5 house. So it's not like it's 12, 14, 16 houses on a block face, but they're the houses remaining on a block face to create a block face. The rest of the money, add up to $700 million, is really a shell game. A large portion of the money is a state assistance in a program called RAD, which is residential, I don't understand, residential something, which is renovating some portion of public housing. You've probably seen that announced over the last 2 years. It's been debated in the press and in radio and so forth, and it already existed. The state's contribution to it had been approved previously. It just involves taxes and bonds. It doesn't involve any contribution of state money. The second major program is in the subsidized housing program, of which the governor of the state just announced 6 out of 17 projects would be awarded to the city. That happens every year. The city gets a certain amount of these tax credit properties. There's a state formula that exists as to how the sites are selected. So if you look back over the last few years, the city's got, depending how you calculate it, the city's got millions of dollars on that program, and we continue to get millions of dollars out of the program. So there's really very little new other than the demolition money. And the demolition money, if it is appropriated, will significantly speed up the city's effort to tear down vacant houses. Now, what about these vacant houses? As preservationists, your immediate reaction, my immediate reaction is not to tear down the vacant house, fix it up. And you follow the vacant to value program probably that the mayor initiated. And what that involved was going out and looking at this. And again, there's a lot of debate about how many vacant houses there are in the city and how you define what a vacant house is. But if you define it as vacant and abandoned, not just vacant and up for sale, there's arguably 16,000 vacant houses in the city. Some of them owned by the city, some of them privately owned. The city went out and evaluated them, the neighborhoods they were in, and decided which are in neighborhoods that if you fix them up, somebody would move into, and which are in neighborhoods if you fix them up, nobody would move into. There are 10,000 in the latter category that the city has slated for demolition. And so there's 4,000 that the governor and the mayor are talking about, speeding up a demolition program that already existed. Again, a public policy issue. Is that the best way to spend the money? Are these the right houses to tear down? Reasonable people would disagree. And one other policy issue, and then I'll stop and talk about whatever you want to talk about, or go home. The EBDI project. The area north of Johns Hopkins Hospital is East Baltimore Development Initiative, EBDI, 72 acres between the hospital and the railroad tracks in Eager Street, between Broadway and Patterson Park Avenue. Now, Hopkins was faced a number of years ago with the community. Hopkins had a bad reputation with the community because over the years they had taken low-income African-American houses, torn them down, where the city had, in most cases, and displaced them and turned the land over to Hopkins. So Hopkins formed this town gown committee of local residents, and local city council members, and African-American members of the faculty, Dr. Carson in those days when he was sane, and other African-American faculty at Hopkins to deal with town gown relationships and what went on around Hopkins. And Hopkins was faced with the issue. Hopkins, as you know, is the biggest employer in the city. It's the success story, along with Under Armour and the University of Maryland, is the success story in growing employment in the city. So Hopkins was faced with the issue, should they continue to grow in East Baltimore, or should they grow in Baltimore County, Montgomery County, or someplace else? They didn't have any place to grow. The area between Johns Hopkins and Eager Street and the railroad had the worst demographic data of any census tract in the state in terms of crime rate, lead paint, abandoned properties, educational level, abandonment. 2/3 of the houses had already been abandoned. Either they were vacant lots or vacant houses. And so what to do about that? And so the decision was made to clear that area and relocate the tenants. Now the problem with relocation in the past was, in the early days, if you were a tenant, you got nothing. The landlord was paid to the value of the house. It was up to the tenant to go someplace else. If you were a homeowner, you got the value of your house, which today would say be $10,000, $5,000. Where could you buy a house for $5,000 or $10,000? So under the Uniform Relocation Act, which was passed federal legislation a couple years ago, the homeowners get paid the cost of a comparable house in a good neighborhood. So homeowners got $165,000 for their house and took that money and bought a house in Hamilton or Northwood or someplace else. The tenants got 5 years of rent subsidy. So the neighborhood was largely cleared, and you've seen the expansion in the neighborhood. Now there's been a lot of pushback. Well, the first housing that was built in this area, my view is the whole area should have been used for Hopkins expansion or job creation, because you can build low-income housing in East Baltimore in hundreds of different places. But in any event, they're back and forth with the neighborhood, and advocates of the neighborhood, some of the area should be for housing. So the first housing was built there was subsidized housing, one for elderly, one for families. The people who were moved were given first right to return, to take a unit. Only 6 wanted to come back. When the people were asked, were polled, who were moved, do you want to come back to the neighborhood, not there or anyplace else? Almost nobody wanted to move back to the neighborhood. So it is an example of a clearance of a low-income neighborhood and the relocation of tenants versus taking a neighborhood and rehabilitating it for the people that are there, which is a better alternative. You go right across the street to the Gay Street Urban Renewal Project, which is one of the things that I was involved with as housing commissioner. That was done to rehouse the people that lived in that neighborhood. And the houses are still there, they're successful and so forth. But the children are going to a segregated poverty school with low test scores and living in a high crime area. Are they better off or not? Who's to decide whether they're better off or not? Do they think they're better off? Would they rather live in something they're familiar with, or would they rather live in Timonium, which they're unfamiliar with, or Hamilton? So anyway, let me stop with those random issues and see if any of you have any questions or criticisms, suggestions. No? David? I don't want you to get up, I want you to ask a question. Or Julian, I'm sure, has something on his mind.
Many questions. So what would be the posed it or something like that? Can you find an answer to all the questions that you just asked?
Well, unfortunately, these questions are not publicly discussed. I mean, if you take, just at random, you take the control, it's called the Thompson case in Baltimore, the low-income movement out of the city. That was a federal court decision to direct that. When the case was brought, I thought what we were doing was getting 5,000 Section 8 units from Baltimore City that they wouldn't otherwise have gotten. And to help the city move people out, or help people move out, that cost the city more than they paid the city. You know, we met consumers of public service. The city would say, terrific, you know, isn't that wonderful? On the other hand, the city hired a lawyer to spend millions of dollars opposing the lawsuit, millions of dollars down the drain. And why is that? Well, because two reasons. One, they said, well, you're accusing us of segregation, you know, being discriminating. I said, I was housing commissioner for 9 years and we only built public in white neighborhoods because the city council wouldn't approve anything in a white neighborhood. So I'm accusing myself of racism or discrimination. What are you worried about? Well, this all happened before you became a mayor. So, and one other thing that irritates me. There have been 2 suits against the housing authority, one for lead paint and public housing and one for sexual abuse of tenants by maintenance men. Now, both are outrageous, and, you know, but the agitation of the press and people of goodwill is, oh, why didn't the housing authority pay millions of dollars to the people who had lead paint in their house, which, you know, you should, arguably, and why don't they pay millions of dollars to the women who were sexually abused? They should, but where do people think that money comes from? Comes from the housing authorities, money that they would otherwise use to rehabilitate all the units that are behind in maintenance. So it isn't it is a zero-sum game. If you spend money on this, you don't spend it on that. So the press doesn't weigh the policy issues. Just take $6 million and give it to these 4 families. And what about the $10,000 a unit that 500 people, whatever it is, would have their units repaired? So again, it's a policy question, but it's not discussed. And so that's true of most of these questions. The issue of whether the expressway should have been built or not through Fells Point and through the Inner Harbor was not subject to any public debate and referendum. It was up to the mayor of Baltimore to decide. Now, he had to stand for election, so you could say that, you know, that he would be held accountable one way or the other. But there wasn't any referendum on an issue of that kind, or maybe should there be. But anyway, these are complicated and difficult questions. Yes, ma'am. Oh, man, everybody's. About my view of the new zoning ordinance and its effect on Fells Point. I really don't know enough about it to have a view, but I'm glad that Romaine is here because I owe her an apology. When I was housing commissioner, she was head of CHAP, and I considered CHAP the enemy. You know, that I wanted to do things and CHAP was getting in the way all the time. And I wish I could revisit that. We'll take Waterloo Road, for instance. I don't know how many of you remember a group of houses on St. Paul Street between Center and Monument on the east side of the street, which was a very significant group of buildings, and it was part of a block that had been passed as an urban renewal demolition site prior to my becoming housing commissioner. And a few people, I don't think the senator was on my case about that, but some people were saying, you know, preserve Waterloo Row. And my sort of simplistic view was it was my job to tear it down. The city council had passed this ordinance to tear it down, and I was going to tear it down. Today, I would have kept it up. And so in any event, you live and learn. Yeah. Oh, is that right? So I apologize. Yes, sir.
I remember And they were talking about reorganization of piggyback taxes, and one of the things that they were talking about was where the city goes, the county goes. And the responsibility of the regional government in having an impact to better the city. And what I understand, and you may have better understanding this, there have been cities like Boston, San Francisco, who have gone in, reduced their property tax, cut them in half, and that was an easier way to get 10,000 people back into the city than it was to, I just want,
Well,
thoughts you have on that?
there's a professor at Loyola that has written a number of articles, Wall Street Journal and locally, about if we cut our property tax in half, everybody would, not everybody, but a significant number of people would move back to the city and other people would build things in the city. It would build a assessable base up to the point where you got as much as you got before, but the property tax would be half as much. Simplistically, it sounds very appealing, but to cut the property tax in half would mean $370 million lost revenue in the city. Where would that $370 million? There's several people running for mayor in the previous election. I'm not talking about this election, by the way, my daughter's running for mayor. Bring that to your attention. But in the previous election, a number of the candidates said cut the property tax in half. In fact, all of the candidates said, other than the one that won. And nobody had remote clue about where they would make up the $370 million. Would they cut the police department in? Take the whole police budget. Would they cut the city school system? It would take twice what the city contributes to the school system. So, long answer to a short question, I don't think it's a realistic option. It'd be nice. If they went to the state, in San Francisco, which did this, the state said they would make up the loss in property tax revenue for a number of years, so the city didn't have to cut anything. But the state would say they'd give us $370 million a year for 5 years and see what happened. That'd be great. We don't have a distinguished senator in Annapolis to get that anymore. Yes, sir.
The highways really back in the 60s or 70s, but even here, if you look at it now, that the developers are acting in the city, approval of developments are acting as if the highway issue, our traffic enforcement has become intolerable and is going to become even more intolerable. You were part of the housing. Does it seem to you like the city is out of control and approving developments without any contingent traffic planning? We don't see it.
Well, I think the question was the traffic has gotten awful in the city,
Yes.
in certain parts of the city. And the worst intersection is President and Pratt. And the traffic going east from President Street is probably the most congested in the city, and then along Lombard and 9th Street and so forth. And the rest of the city is not anywhere near as bad as it is in southeast Baltimore. And I think the question was what thought has been given by the city when they approve various projects in that area of the city about the traffic in that area of the city. Of course, the red line was supposed to go through that area and was supposed to relieve congestion. People along Boston Street didn't want the red line. They didn't want the disruption. Not that that's why Hogan turned it down, but the opposition to the red line wasn't from West Baltimore, it was from Southeast Baltimore. And so the red line's gone, and so why would the city approve any additional residential or office construction in that area where the traffic is already unbearable? Good question. Now Central Avenue is being extended, as you know, to connect with Inner Harbor East, so to provide, in addition to Caroline Street, another access to that area. But all that's doing is bringing the additional people that are going to be in Inner Harbor East out to Gleason Avenue or Fleet Street, Allenstown Street, and further congest things. So I agree with you. And you can get a chance to elect a new city councilman from your district so you can take them to task, because nothing gets approved in the city of a redevelopment nature if the councilman from that area disagrees with it, for good or bad. So it's a real leverage point.
Ladies and gentlemen,
you know, there's so many, as you said, neighborhoods that need preservation. So the question is, what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to solve these really tricky problems? But anyway, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. And I was remiss yet again, and I'd like to acknowledge Laura and Tony Norris for the wonderful group of youngsters that came and played for us this afternoon. Thank you all for coming.